teacher, teacher trainer, academic manager, materials writer, and educational consultant. Carol specializes in pre-primary and primary English language education. She is an award-winning author and former president of IATEFL. So you can find more about Carol by visiting her website www.carolreed.com. Now, where's Carol? Can you turn on your camera, Carol, please?
Yeah, here I am.
I think I can hear you. Oh, we can see you now.
Here I am.
Okay, welcome.
Can you hear me as well?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And first of all, thanks to IATEFL for organising this fantastic event to bring us together and for inviting me to do this webinar. It's wonderful to see so many of you here, and thank you so much for coming. I know that we're all going through a really difficult time, but we will get through this. And the solidarity and support that we're giving each other at the moment within our professional community is more important than ever. There have been so many generous gestures by publishers, by IATEFL SIGs, by IATEFL for organising this conference as well, and by individual professionals giving free access to their materials. And also, in recent weeks, I've been attending some fantastically useful webinars from wise colleagues to help upskill the way we teach online. This session this afternoon is going to be highly practical, and as an ongoing task throughout, I'd like to ask you to contribute suggestions in the chat box to use or adapt the ideas that I'm going to share with you in two ways. First of all, for different ages and types of learners, and secondly, for implementing them both in synchronous and asynchronous ways. But before we start, I'd like us all to do a bit of positive thinking. Every one of us, without exception, is currently going through a worrying and stressful time. Some of us are living on our own. Some of us are living with others, both of which can be stressful in different ways. Some of us are confined to a city flat, not allowed out for exercise, and haven't seen a green space for weeks. Some of us are looking after children and involved in homeschooling at the same time as working remotely in our jobs. Some of us may have lost work and have financial worries. Some of us may have elderly relatives we can no longer visit. Some of us have friends and family who have been directly affected by the virus. Some of us may have been affected ourselves. But even in these extraordinary and uncertain times, there are things to feel grateful for. And as we know from research and Tammy Gregerson's session earlier today, it helps strengthen our well-being and our ability to empower the learners we teach, to reframe the way we think about things and identify them. So I'd love to ask you now, as part of our professional IATEFL family, to share in the chat box some of the things that, despite everything, you feel grateful for at the moment. For example, I feel grateful for technology and for the daily contact with my family, none of whom is here. I feel grateful for the close bond with friends and colleagues. I feel grateful that I'm safe and well. I feel grateful that I have clean water and soap to wash my hands. What wonderful things coming in through there. They're coming so fast I can hardly walk. Yeah, causes, opening your eyes, sunny weather, fantastic. Well, that is wonderfully uplifting to see all those things. And of course, if we keep our own well-being strong, we are also able to empower our learners. So on to our session then. And actually, what does empower mean in this context? What am I really talking about? And I've put together my understanding in this context based on various dictionaries that have helped me to do this. I'm not going to read this out, So just have a look at that there, read it, or take a screenshot if you want. So this is really what we're talking about in this session. And the next question, what are the Sustainable Development Goals and why are we focusing on them? Why have I chosen to focus on them? And the global goals, I call them global goals, it's easier to say than Sustainable Development Goals. And these are, and I quote from the UN, a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. And the global goals were set in 2015 by the United Nations General Assembly and intended to be achieved by the year 2030. So we've got 10 years to go. And why focus on these now? Well, there will be a before and an after to this crisis in terms of many, many things. But just to focus briefly on education and social responsibility. I mean, who am I to know what on earth will actually happen? But there is a continuum of possibilities. And in education, at one end of the continuum, and I think actually things will never be the same again, but there may be a seismic shift to more adaptive online learning where teachers are increasingly sidelined and irrelevant. Or, at the other end of the continuum, there may be a renaissance in recognizing the true value of the teacher's role in learning, whether in a face-to-face, synchronous or asynchronous context. And we'll all surely end up being much better at doing our jobs online too. In terms of social responsibility, at one end of the continuum, individuals, communities and nations may become more inward-looking than ever and just look out for themselves. Or, at the other end of the continuum, people may become kinder, more considerate, and talk and listen to and help each other more. No prizes for guessing which end of these continuums I, and I'm sure all of us, would like to be. And this is also one of the reasons I've chosen to focus on the global goals. Educationally, they give us a vehicle to enrich teaching and learning and enable students to achieve outcomes that go way beyond just learning language in a way that cannot be taught by computers alone. And in terms of social responsibility, they provide a context which promotes attitudes and values such as cooperation, collaboration, empathy, and respect for others that underpin the development of a fairer world. Two other pragmatic reasons for this focus on global goals are, first of all, the wealth of free online resources that you can tap into, both for synchronous and asynchronous teaching and learning, and I'll give you the links a bit later on. And secondly, the potential flexibility and adaptability of practical classroom ideas for different levels and ages and different modes of delivery, as from upper primary. And as I said earlier, I'd love you all to share your suggestions for additional or alternative ways of doing things as we go on. So when we introduce students to the topic of the global goals, we might get them to think about some true-false statements. I'm going to show you some true-false statements now, and I'd just like you to read them. I'm not going to read them out, and put the number and T or F, whether you think they're true or false, in the chat box. Okay, so are you ready? Off we go. What about this first statement? Is it true or false? False, true. Okay, we're quite divided. Oh, amazing, you're so fast. Fantastic. Okay, actually, that statement is false. It's not the world's 50 richest people. It's actually the world's 26 richest people. And that information comes from Oxfam in 2019. What about this next one? Is it true or false? What do you think? True or false? Off you go. Let's see. True, true. Lots of people think that's true. Absolutely right. Well, you are absolutely right about that one. This is true, and this comes from the World Health Organization in 2019. What about this next one then? True or false? Let's see your ideas. Okay. A lot of you think that's true. Okay. This actually is false, and the real answer is even more depressing. The number is 264 million, and that information comes from UNESCO. And what about this next one? What do you think of that? Is that true or false? What do you think? True or false? Lots of different ideas. Okay. This one is actually true, and this comes from a report on the UN, from the UN on women. In 2019, but actually apparently there is quite an increase from 1995 when there was only just over 10%. Okay, and the last one here, what do you think about this one? True or false? The last one. Let's see you go. True, see if you can be even faster this time. You're amazing. Okay, and this one actually is false, and the true figure is around, they don't know exactly, because of course we don't know exactly how many species of animals and plants there are on the planet, but the real answer is actually 1 million, okay? And that comes from a report by the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystems, but it was quoted on the Sustainable Development Goal UN blog. Okay, so here then is a summary of the answers to those statements. And of course, the reason for doing this is to raise interest in our topic, but also we're going to get our students to do other activities. So we can get them to prepare their own true-false statements in breakout rooms and then try them out on each other. We can actually get them to follow up and check the sources of the facts to see if any of them might be fake news. We could also get them to prepare their own true-false statements that apply specifically to their own country. And I'm sure you've got lots of other ideas, so do pop them in the chat box if you think of other ideas there. So in terms of identifying the goals, we might actually use images to elicit and pre-teach vocabulary and get our students to predict and identify issues that the goals focus on. And in order to avoid issues of copyright, I increasingly use my own photos, and for everything actually. And once you've got the idea of doing this, it's amazing how quickly you can build up a useful set of photos to use. So what do you think this photo here suggests? What goal might that be to do with? To do with no hunger, absolutely. And Phoebe, you're absolutely right. It looks, you could use this for a session on intercultural competence as well. It's a very typical roast dinner. Yeah, about feeding, healthy food, nourishment, getting the right kind of nutrition. Okay, what about this next one? What's the goal here? What's the goal, do you think, of this one? Sustainability, deforestation, yes, looking after the planet, protecting the environment. Okay, yes, absolutely, fantastic. You're right. And what about this last one? What's this one to do with? No prizes really for guessing here. Education, absolutely, to do with education. And of course, I'm sure a lot of you will have a fantastic number of ideas of how we can exploit these visuals for learning. One of the things that I like to do, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, is visible thinking routines, the Harvard Project Zero, where you have, for example, a favourite one is See, Think, Wonder, where students describe what they see, they then think about that context, maybe in this education context, where this classroom is, what are the children like who go there, and then they wonder and formulate questions that they would like to find out about. And another one that I like to use is think, puzzle, explore as well. And of course, here we could also do a describe the photo and guess the goal activity, a kind of typical communicative activity in pairs where students describe the image and then identify the goal. And another thing that's nice to do when you're working synchronously is to get children or students, older students, to take their own photos of objects at home which suggest the goals. For example, they could take a pile of textbooks for education, paracetamol and thermometer for healthcare, and then show their photos to others to guess the goals. Okay, so here then are the 17 goals. And when we're working with them, we can use all of them, or we can use selected ones. For myself, when I'm working with upper primary or lower secondary, I would tend to cut goals 9, 12 and 17 because they actually have quite complex concepts and it may be a bit too many. But an important point that I wanted to share with you all is that these icons can all be downloaded freely, either like this or individually. So you can use them for all kinds of games in synchronous learning context to build up familiarity with the goals, and particularly with younger learners, this works well. So will you just have a good look at those goals now? And I want you then in just a moment to tell me what is the missing goal. Are you ready to do that? Okay, first one in the chat box, going to get a prize. Are you ready? Okay, what's the missing goal? What's the missing goal? You got, yeah, absolutely. Okay, and what about this time? What's the missing goal? Lovely, yes. And the last one here, what's the missing goal? Climate action. Okay, so these icons are absolutely fantastic for playing all kinds of games. Memory, bingo, snap, and students can also use them to play a simple board game with counter and dice. So, for example, you can make up the rules or they can land on a square and you name an issue related to the goal or a way to solve it. They can also use the goals to create their own board games and then exchange and play each other's. And as we introduce the goals to our students, we also want to familiarize them with relevant vocabulary to talk about them. And so a team game that we can play includes saying letters of the alphabet in random order, and students take turns to respond with key words relating to the global goals and score points for their team. So for example, if I say P, can you think of any words that relate to the goals and put them in the chat box if you can? So for example, poverty, peace, oh, you've done it, wonderful, partnerships. And what about if I say E? What words can you think of for E? Education, energy, equality, fantastic economic growth, empower, environment, wonderful. And what about H? What could you put for H? H, anybody? Health, maybe, hunger, and so on. Okay, so this could be a fun kind of introduction and familiarization with what the goals are and the vocabulary related to them. And as part of beginning to broaden and deepen students' understandings of the goal, it's important to establish the aims of the goals in language that the students can understand. So here are some examples. These ones are suitable for upper primary and lower secondary. And you can see there I've laid it out in terms of it's a matching activity. The students match the goals and definitions. And of course, you know, for example, one there is D, and you can put the others in the chat box if you like. And for older learners, of course, they can be more complex and sophisticated. Or students can come up with the definitions themselves, doing a bit of research to ensure, and all those definitions are actually, definitions for all the goals are actually in the publication that's referenced below. So you could do this as a card matching activity in a face-to-face classroom. You could do it in an asynchronous way as a worksheet, or you could do it as a whole class activity with students identifying the correct definitions as you name the goals. And of course, we might then want to move on and use a virtual version of a cooperative learning activity that's probably familiar to all of you, using a graphic organizer, a placemat, and get our students to work in breakout rooms, if we can create breakout rooms, and to prioritize what they think are between 3 and 6, it's up to you, of the most important goals. And they formulate, note down and discuss their individual ideas before coming up with a collective result and reasons to justify their choices. They then share their ideas with the whole class, and they can subsequently rank order the rest of the goals. Something that you may have noticed is that the logos of the goals are actually quite sophisticated. And the aim of this activity is for students to actually design logos for goals of their choice that they think may have more impact and be easily understood by everyone, or be particularly relevant for their own country. You may think that this activity is more suitable for younger learners, but it can also be an interesting and varied challenge to be carried out in an asynchronous way by older learners using online design tools. And students can then compare their designs and possibly vote for the ones they like best. Another aspect of the goal that gets learners to think more deeply about them is to explain to them that they can broadly be divided into 6 themes. Or, as a cooperative learning and problem-solving activity and more advanced class, older learners could work together and actually identify and define the themes themselves. If you're working with upper primary or lower secondary, it's best to give them the definitions of the themes in language that they can understand. They then work together to categorize the goals. And this also leads to some very specific language practice. So, for example, here we have the goals categorized. So, for example, children might say, I think goal 2, 0 hunger, goes here under number 2, because if people don't have enough to eat, they get sick. I think goal 5, gender equality, goes here under number 4, because it's fair that boys and girls are equal. Can you think of any other reasons why the goals are categorized in that way? See any ideas in the chat box? Okay, so exactly, Tien, we're talking about categorization and justification, and actually getting our students to recognize that there is overlap and connection between all the goals. Yeah, you're going to get the relevant links. Is someone asking for the relevant links? I'm going to give them in a bit. Okay, so this connectivity between the different goals, as well as identifying the broad themes, we want our students to recognize these connections. And again, you can do this as a whole class activity. You can do it as a cooperative learning activity in pairs or groups, and you can do it in various different ways. And this is what I like to call global goal spidergrams, okay? And in fact, what we do, I've just got 6 goals up on the screen there. You could have 10, you could have 8, you could have all of them. And what the students do is to try and think of connections between the 2 goals. And of course, this actually provides wonderful language practice in this sense of conditionals. So for example, let me give you an example. If children are hungry, goal 2, then it's difficult for them to concentrate and learn at school. Let's have a look at another one, or perhaps you can suggest your ideas. What could we say for that one? What could we say for that? Okay, well, we might say something like, if people don't have jobs, they're poor. So we're making that connection between those 2 goals. What about this next one, for example? If there isn't clean water to drink or wash your hands, people get ill. And what about this next one? If people don't have enough to eat, they get ill. And this next one, if people aren't educated, goal 4, they don't get decent jobs. And one more here, if people are poor, they may not have access to clean water and sanitation. And I'm sure you can think of lots more. And I'd like to just share what happens when you do an activity like this with students. That to start off with, they find it really hard to make those connections. And you probably need to do several examples with them. But once they get the idea, their spidergram becomes completely elaborate. And because we're following this language pattern, they are very motivated to think through these connections. And of course, they were developing language and thinking skills as well. And students might report back on their spidergrams using a version of circle time. And circle time, of course, is traditionally associated with teaching very young children. But actually the idea of taking turns and listening respectfully to others in the group is important for older learners. And it's also important in an online environment and provides useful specific language practice. So circle time can be used to encourage students to express any view, their views in relation to any aspects of the goal. So for example, I think goal 4 is the most important goal because one way to end poverty would be to ... Or they can use circle time to talk about goals that are more or less relevant, easy or hard to implement, where you live. And with older students, you can ask 1 or 2 to record ideas and build up a mind map as other students speak. So circle time then, which is, it doesn't need to be just young children sitting in a circle on the floor. And actually, when you do circle time with older students, you also foster values and attitudes of listening to each other, respecting turn-taking, and so on, as well as getting the language and integrated thinking skills practice as well. So when you start working with the global goals with your students, if you find that they're interested in the global goals or specific topics of the global goals, then you might actually decide to use the global goals as an organizational tool, either to produce whole units of work to supplement and enrich your course book and any other online materials that you're using. And you might do this with 1 or 2 topics, you might do it with 6. I mean, this would depend very much on student response and student choice. And if we were going to do this, we would need to select the global goals that we're going to focus on. We'd need to sequence them. We'd maybe need to have an introductory unit doing some of the activities that I've shown you a little bit of earlier, followed by units of work on different topics. We'd need to plan the units, syllabus objectives, materials, and learning outcomes. So let's actually have a look at an example based on one of the global goals. And the one I've chosen is Global Goal 15, which is life on land. And my example is planned to be suitable for upper primary and lower secondary children, but it could serve as a template for other ages and levels as well. So for example, in my Global Goal Unit Planner, you've got here examples of some of the topics that I might cover. Here are 10, and that might be way too much. You never want to go on. What's it? Somebody's moving my slides. Please don't. Please don't. Thank you very much. Okay, so here's the Global Goals Unit Planner. There are 10 topics there, but as I was saying, you could just have 3 of those topics. And you could actually do a vote with the students to see the topics that they're most interested in. And then we would also need to go on to develop our Global Goal curriculum objectives. And so just to give you an example of this, I've chosen to do the one on endangered animals. So here you have there a sample of Global Goal curriculum objectives. Now obviously I'm not going to read all this out. If you want a copy of it, take a screenshot, okay? But I think what I'd like to ask you to notice is the real world focus of learning here, the application to local context, so that it's not learning about these goals in abstraction, you are applying it to the world you live in. There is choice in the outcomes, the suggested outcomes there. There is an approach, a blended approach. There is natural use of technology and synchronous and asynchronous learning. And the examples of language and vocabulary could obviously be adjusted upwards or downwards, but upwards probably, according to age and level. And you'll also notice there that in the last column, I've got, sorry, a water moment. I've got values education, which is hugely important, of course, when we're working with younger children. So the values education aspect there. Now, just to give you a flavour of materials that we might use, and again to highlight the resources that are available for you online. So here's an example of a graphic story, and it's best to read, maybe best to read outside the class or to read inside the class, online, by pairs and groups. You obviously don't want to print it out, be waste of paper, expensive, and so on. And these are freely available stories like this online. And this particular one, Wild for Life, draws attention to 2 goals actually, to 14, which is life below water, and also life on land, and the need to protect the environment. And in this comic, young people and animals are able to communicate with one another, and humans are harming and killing animals for their parts to make unnecessary products, which is disrupting the harmony of the natural world. And the story shows endangered species working together and seeking the help of children to save threatened animals. And the mission is to get everyone, especially younger generations, involved in helping to end the illegal trade in wildlife, to save our beautiful planet, and I would also add probably to protect our health as well. And of course, in using a story like this in class, we would exploit it in the same way that we do any text or story. So we might introduce some vocabulary, set some pre-questions, have comprehension questions, and lead in to a role play and discussion. And the one I do is, you know, what would you do if you were in the situation of Anaya in the story, because she is actually given an elephant tusk. And what do, you know, if you don't agree about it, and so on. Okay, so another little example of material, an endangered animal report. Students do research on animals of their choice. This can be a basis of making a class ebook, a video, a podcast, an interview, a PowerPoint presentation. Again, I know this is low level and for upper primary and lower secondary, but it can easily be adapted and extended to be suitable for older, more advanced learners. And actually, I would just point out to you there that the source of this report is actually one of the materials that we have all, as a professional community, been kindly by the publishers given free access to during this crisis. So you'll be able to access it there as well. And here, of course, is an example of project work. Again, this is low level, but the principle of developing an outcome in terms of project work with this work on the global goals is applicable to all ages and levels. And another approach would be to use inquiry-based learning and to get students to formulate a question that they're interested in finding out about in relation to the global goals, and do online research on sites you recommend, and then present their results in the form of a written or audio report, a PowerPoint presentation, or a video. And once the students are familiar with the global goals and have done quite a lot of work on them, you might actually organize a class debate, okay? And I've just chosen something there for the debate where we could prepare pro and con cards to support students' thinking and language, or not. And students could work in groups, in breakout rooms, to prepare their arguments for either side of the debate. And you could feed in the kind of functional language that they'll need to use in the debate as appropriate. So, for example, a pro might be that people will recognize that the more investment in economic health and sanitation infrastructure in vulnerable contexts, the more likely we are to be able to control or stop a pandemic developing in the future. An example of a con might be, with devastated economies, affected countries will mainly focus on protecting themselves and invest much less in the Sustainable Development Goals. Then you could have the debate, and afterwards, if you like, if you're using such tools, you could get the learners to use an online poll such as Mentimeter, which I expect some of you are familiar with, to decide, you know, what the outcome of the debate is. Okay, so I hope I've given you enough of a flavour to get the idea of the benefits of learning through the global goals. Okay, I'm afraid this is quite a text-heavy slide. I'm not going to go through all the points. Do take a screenshot if you would like them. They're also actually based on and adapted from the reference, a chapter that I wrote in the publication below. But essentially, I would say that the global goals give us an opportunity to work with meaningful, engaging content which relates to the real world and develops language, thinking and social skills and responsible attitudes and values in ways which build confidence and competence and empower students both as language learners and as responsible global citizens. And I promised earlier that I would share with you the online resources, and here they are, the two main sources of input and ideas that I've found. On the left there, you've got the image of the world's largest lesson, where there is a mass of material that you can use, lesson plans for students up to 14, although please don't move my slide. Okay, that you can use. They invariably need adapting for an ELT context. And the other publication on the right there is one that is freely downloadable from the English Agenda site of the British Council and has a wealth of chapters and ideas on how to use the global goals. So I hope that this session has given you some ideas on how to vary the materials that you're using in online classrooms in a way that engages students in talking about issues that really matter and giving them a voice in which to do so. So that really brings me to the end, but I think, thank you very much, but
Yes, Carol, thank you so much. This was a really lovely session. We have 3 more minutes, and can you see the questions here, or would you like me to read them for you? On Go chart.
I can see a question here.
How can we,
but as teachers,
how can we ensure, I guess...
ensure what? Sorry, I'm not quite sure what. Rami.
Yeah, it was...
How can we ensure? I'm not quite sure what... I'm not quite sure what the question is. Shall I answer? Let me answer. Maybe it's Ramiz. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. Ramiz Jawed. Perhaps you could put a clarification what the it refers to there, because I think it's something that came before, but which is no longer there. Another question from Elaine. Do you think it is possible, advisable to incorporate the SDGs into the scope of a book? Or would this be better done as extra activities prepared by the teacher? Well, I think that's an excellent question, Elaine. And I think it depends on several things. It first of all depends on the interest and response of the students. Secondly, it depends on the stamina, energy, time, and all the rest of it that you have as teachers to do this. So I would say that now is perhaps not the time, because I think we're all focused on delivering our classes as best we can. So possibly at the moment, I would use it to supplement, because the thing is, whatever course book you're using, and a lot of course books these days have wonderful digital materials, but you're bound to have, the unit on food, for example. So that provides a natural springboard into looking into the issue of food in a deeper and more relevant global way. And I think actually at the moment, learners, because they are aware of the seriousness of the situation that we're in, they are actually interested in talking about real world things that really matter, rather than kind of, celebrity trivia, which I think most of us globally have realized doesn't actually matter when it comes down to it. Okay, there's adapt the vocabulary level. Well, I think you have to. This is Rajiv asking about the vocabulary level, and I think what you have to do is to. I mean, I think you saw in those themes that I had, the vocabulary is very limited, and obviously you need to select the vocabulary you're going to use, and probably not let those younger students do their own research on the Global Goals website, because the language is actually pretty much beyond them. Okay, other questions here. Questions about how to adapt the activities for an online situation? Well, exactly. I mean, I think I gave you some ideas for the ways that these activities could be used in synchronous situations. And I think some ideas were put in the chat box earlier on. I mean, using breakout rooms, if you can do that to get students to work together on their project ideas, for example.
Thank you so much, Carol.
Rank ordering the goals.
There were so many links shared here in the chat box, so we saved all the links, and we will post the links under the Carol's post on Facebook for everyone, so that people can find the links and use them. Thank you ever so much, Carol, for this wonderful session. Stay tuned, and we'll have, like in 12 minutes, we're starting a new session. See you then. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
One of the chat board mods, could you paste the links again into the chat box?
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Lovely to see you.
And if you can download them, we did put the links into a PDF there, look, which is at the top of the screen. If you're on a mobile device, you won't be able to download it, I'm afraid. But you can download all those links that went through the chat box. So if you want to click it, if you want to take the PDF, you click on the PDF there, which I've just put on in front of Carol's name, look. And you can click that there and download it, or you can just copy and paste from Kirsten's post that she's just put in the chat box. Okay. Is that what it sounds like, Iga? Very funny. All right, and if you're watching on Facebook, we did put it into a comment onto the Facebook. I'll go back and do it again in a moment when I have a moment to change rooms. Yes, please, Bozichka. So we've got about 12 minutes to our next speaker, so you'll hear us go into sound check.